So, I didn't limit myself on this one, I'm just going to let it run as long as I have comments that I want to talk about. I'll also let you know up front that this time I'm going to try doing barely any visual editing throughout. I think long videos make better listeners than watchers anyways, so I'll flash up the comments I'm going to talk about, but I'll also try and read or at least sum them up, so you don't need to worry about missing anything if you are drawing or driving or washing dishes or whatever else you like to get done while you listen to longer videos. Alright, let's cover the biology topics first. Several people added details about bird vision, which I don't think change anything for the Qyaalyon, but they are very interesting. The gist of it is, most mammals have 2 cones in their eyes, humans have 3, and birds generally have 4, which is why we consider most mammals to be colorblind, and why birds can see even more colors than humans. However, having fewer cones allows mammals to see better in the dark. Additionally, birds that can see great distances usually have worse vision up close. I think this is a useful thing to keep in mind with world building. There seems to usually be a trade-off. If you give your fantasy race great distance vision, they might in consequence be farsighted and need reading glasses. If you give a race night vision, they might also be colorblind. It's interesting. Related to this, there was a discussion on the Discord about nearsightedness in humans. A video was linked discussing scientific research on the causes of the rise in nearsightedness. It proposes an interesting theory, that the amount of time we spend indoors, especially while our eyesight is developing as children, is detrimental to our vision. It compared statistics of nearsightedness in school children across the globe, and compared the amount of time they spend indoors versus outdoors. And it makes a lot of sense. If you're outside, you're focusing on distant details, and your vision extends farther than it does inside, where it's only extending to the nearest wall. Maybe the difference is simply exercise. Now, this is just research and a theory, and I'm not stating these as scientific facts, but it reminded me of a while back when I tried to answer the question, what if they need glasses? At that time, I didn't have a good answer other than just that fantasy people rarely wear glasses and they seem to get along fine. But maybe most Qyaalyon have excellent vision, not just because of bird genetics, but because they spend so much time outside. While in contrast, modern-day Nauticans in the underwater city have seen a sharp increase in vision problems. However, since Nauticans are proficient in metallurgy and glassmaking, they could easily develop spectacles. Which does have an interesting sort of symmetry if this whole theory is true. It would mean that the technology to create urban life both causes vision problems and provides remedies for them. Now, this comment is about the birds having third eyelids thing. Okay, so I went outside and I was staring at my chicken, and I looked into her eyes and she looked into mine, and our souls met just for a moment. No, kidding. But I was staring at my chicken, watching her blink, and I realized that she almost never closes her outer eyelid. She mostly only blinks with the inner eyelid, but it's so fast that I've never caught it before until I went out specifically looking for it. So I've decided that I do want to add third eyelids for avians. Regarding the human passing Qyaalyon spy character, I think having third eyelids and having to consciously train yourself to blink with the outer eyelids and then having that weakness of somebody catching on, I think that does have really fun story potential. Pretty much all animals that are said to have a second brain actually only have a clump of nerves. It's never recognizable brain matter. Okay, fine, that makes sense. I guess shoulder blade skulls are out. Even though your world does have magic, I propose helium sacs, like the dive bladder on a fish. Maybe some kind of extra organ making helium or hydrogen that makes you lighter. I am on the fence about this idea. Magic is integral to this world, and I don't want to stray too far from the necessity of it. The idea is that magic and science were both used to knit together the people's DNA by their creators. If they lose connection with that magical source, they will begin to lose their abilities, which in an avian's case would be the ability to fly. Later, after an extended period without access to the magic, their genetic structure would begin to break down. They would become sickly, their organs would begin to shut down, and eventually they would die. However, a hydrogen organ might be one of the first to shut down, contributing to their loss of flight, so that idea could work. I'm gonna keep it solidly on the fence though until I figure out how that would biologically work. Do all Qyaalyon have widow's peaks? Probably. I just kinda drew them that way, but I like it. Also, if I give other avian types feather caps instead of hair, I would probably bring those feathers down low over the forehead, maybe even meeting up with the eyebrows. So I like that crossover between the different groups, if even the more human avians have very low hairlines and deep widow's peaks. Okay, this comment is asking about their toes. Basically that I've just drawn them with normal toes but long nails, and the commenter is pointing out that the toes aren't long enough to function or wrap around things. I agree, their toes should be longer. That is another thing that I just didn't know how to draw. I think their feet would be about the same length as a human's, but I think that it would be proportionally more toe and less foot. However, I do want to point out that our toes are capable of a lot more than we use them for. I saw a video once about a girl born with no arms. I couldn't find it again because it turns out there are lots of videos about similar people. Basically, they use their feet for everything. I remember in the video I saw she went to school and wrote with her toes, and she ate dinner and held her fork with her toes, she changed a baby's diaper with her toes, she put in contact lenses with her toes. So what I'm saying is, yes, the Qyaalyon would have slightly longer toes, but also that toes don't need to be a second set of hands in order to be useful. I know an animal rescuer who has had to raise quite a few birds that have lost their tails one way or another. They can fly fine, they just can't make a sharp turn. Ha 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 ha. Vindication. I'm fine with that. Maybe the falcon people, who are supposed to be the fastest, fanciest flyers, maybe they'll have leg feathers or full-on tails, but it's settled, I'm leaving the Qyaalyon as is. The owl has no oil in its feathers. This comment is interesting. I've heard it before, and I think the lack of oil helps them fly quieter. It's an interesting idea, though, about owl avians being seen differently from other avians if they don't have musk. I haven't done much work on the owl people yet, but I'm excited to because I think there are a lot of factors that would make them really different from most avians. Maybe without musk, they would be seen as cold, emotionless killers, or maybe they'd be seen as more similar to the wingless mainlanders. It's interesting potential there. Dyeing feathers sounds cool, but dyeing feathers of birds in real life affects the oils in the bird's feathers, which can cause damage to their feathers. That's a good point. I am thinking I was too quick to greenlight the feather dyeing. We'll see. However, there was a response to that comment pointing out that you can make colored oils by diffusion. And that might be the answer. I've already thought that, similar to our use of deodorant, maybe avians who live in closer contact with wingless people use scented oils to cover up their natural musk since the mainlanders don't care for it. If they do have access to safe synthetic oils, it's not much of a greater stretch to imagine that some of those oils are colored and can temporarily dye one's feathers. However, there was another comment talking about the bearded vulture, which rolls around in colored dirt to dye its wings a reddish shade, and another person mentioned chalk paint. So I don't think feather coloring for festivals is completely out of the running, but it probably won't take the form I described in the previous video. This question is asking about trading feathers between species for transplanting. I definitely think that would happen. Smaller species might want longer primaries for a flight boost, and it might just be for some of those aesthetic pops of color we were talking about last time. I do have a setup already worked in for a sort of black market feather trading thing. In that context, I was using it for mainlanders collecting different sorts of avian feathers like trophies, but it would also make sense for it to have started with just avians trading feathers for utility reasons. Oh, and the reply below it saying that they thought feather transplanting would be a very sacred thing. I disagree. If it started out through pure utility, repairing broken feathers, I don't think they would care exactly who the feather came from. A feather is more like hair than a kidney. However, I do think the undersides of the wings would be more special and significant. One more comment on the feather transplanting. They're going to need sharp knives or scissors to get a clean cut. I have no comment, I just thought it'd be a cool opportunity to share this clip of the archer guy I mentioned before. He showed me how an obsidian edge is so sharp you can literally shave with it. Another thing about primitive technology that I've never really appreciated. Okay, going all the way back to Bio 1, it looks like the clothing is a little bit see-through, not by much, but it's enough to be considered nudity in human cultures. Do the Qyaalyon not really care, or would the females put some sort of liner there? I don't think it's that see-through, and I was originally thinking that they're just a bit more casual about skin, but thinking about comfort, as leather ages it tends to get drier and tougher, and I can see certain places getting to be rough and irritating. However, I did recently think of a source of wool they could utilize on the plains, which would be a good thing to make liners with. More on that another time though, when I eventually get to make my dedicated Qyaalyon clothing video. Okay, a bunch more weapon suggestions that we will cover briefly. I think I've settled on crossbows as the second weapon. I think it works thematically, and the fact that they would need to trade for at least the metal parts would explain why it's relatively new technology on the plains. I also like that it has some advantages over the traditional bow, such as range and power and easier aiming, but it also has some disadvantages, like only holding one bolt and being harder to reload, especially from the air. That would explain why it hasn't completely taken over yet. A flight crossbow might need to be modified to keep the dart from falling out midair and to make a midair reload easier, but I think it's within the realm of possibility. Okay, other weapons suggested: lassos, tangle nets, and barbed drop lines. I can see those being used. I see bows and crossbows as being the cultural norm, but that doesn't mean they're the only thing that would ever be used. Throwing knives were also mentioned. I think not for the Qyaalyon, as they have to trade for metal tools and rely more on stone and obsidian flint knapping for their knives, and you wouldn't want to throw around a delicate stone blade. But in terms of all avians everywhere, I can see some using throwing knives. Basically, any distance weapon will be preferable, as any close range weapon would neutralize their natural advantage of flight. Another suggestion was blowpipes and poison darts. I've got that one on my list for a more jungle, rainforest-based avian group. I don't think there would be many sources of poison on the plains, and poison darts just seem more thematic in a jungle anyways. This person was discussing different techniques used in Mongolian, Korean, and African archery. I thought the African shooting style was really interesting in that the arrow hand is held back at the sternum and it's the bow itself which is drawn forward. I also like that Korean archery uses very compact short bows, often shorter than 24 inches. It's all cool. On a sociolinguistic level, I'd expect their language to be very melodic and sing-songy, with spoken poetry, prose, and storytelling always accompanied by at least a certain degree of musical rhythm. At the very least, birdsong is. I like the idea of their main, more human language being still a bit melodic, maybe even a tonal language relying heavily on vowels. Practically, if everyone speaks both of these languages, they should be related and similar enough for them to be easily learned. Maybe like how Chinese writing has the simplified version and the traditional version, or English has print and cursive, but an audible form of that, if that makes sense. I'm not linguistic enough to know what I'm talking about and if it's possible. I personally think that the Qyaalyon would have a lot of musical storytelling like live theater. I agree. I mean, think back to Homer and even Shakespeare with the iambic pentameter. Telling stories in verse form makes it easier to remember long epics, and the Qyaalyon don't have a real written language, so I think it works thematically and practically. I have a suggestion. Each flock could have a special flock symbol. Yes, they don't have a written language as we would recognize it with grammar and all of that, but they do have almost like an early stage pictographic form of writing. Since a lot of the proper names are based on nouns pertaining to the natural world around them, a name meaning oak tree could be written with a symbol of a tree. So I think there are definitely symbols for the different flocks, the gods, the guilds, different status markers, and even individual names. I hope the flocks do still keep track of the bloodlines in some way to try and maintain unrelated pairs mating. The winter villages could have a mural or a tapestry or something to keep track of who's related. Yes, I like this idea, but I'm not completely sure how to implement it. There is the difficulty of how much they move around, even changing their surnames based on which flock they're in, and then the lack of a full written language. I have been playing around with an idea that maybe when they come of age, they create a symbol for themselves. It might partly incorporate their name, but they might also design it to reflect how they want to be seen. It might fill a role similar to our signature. The hard thing would be that it wouldn't necessarily be readable if a person didn't know who you were. But the same is also true of signatures. So I like the idea of a family tree, but I'm benching it until I can figure out exactly how it would work. Though this did also make me think of another thing. I've mentioned before that it's considered lucky to choose a partner with different colored wings than yours. Maybe by this point the perception has evolved past lucky. Maybe nowadays choosing someone with the same wing color is seen like, well, not marrying your cousin, but marrying your distant cousin. Not illegal, and probably distant enough not to matter, but still universally yucky. Though if they were to use this as a metric, it would be a pretty surfacey, dumb metric, as we've discussed that siblings can just as easily have different wing colors. But that doesn't mean that young people wouldn't start to consider it important. So the mating is kind of like the rumor that it's best to marry your best friend. You mate with somebody you know understands you more than anyone else, like a very close friend. Yes, I think so. I have a juicy fun fact that you could work into the Qyaalyon. Although monogamy and life partners are common with birds, genetics favor different mates, so you'll see both males and females sneaking off to mate with other pairs. So you could have it in Qyaalyon society where monogamy is the norm, but casual adultery is a thing. There's a lot to talk about here. I've got to admit, I don't like this, but it's probably just personal. I don't world build for pure wish fulfillment, but the Qyaalyon are definitely my most wish fulfillment-y. And to put it lightly, I personally find casual adultery a very unattractive quality in a culture. However, there is an element of the Qyaalyon that favors this idea. They aren't moneyed, and they don't have a real class system, no land ownership, no titles to pass on. There isn't that incentive a lot of our cultures have had to produce a verifiable heir. So I do think that they would have a lot less harshness about the whole thing, and that they would be more open to raising children that aren't biologically theirs. As the reply said, maybe the act of raising the children together is more important than who is the parent. Although, another point, because of the wing colorations, a child born out of wedlock has a good chance of being easily identifiable. I can see this debate being one of the things flock splits are based on, the level to which a flock expects monogamy to be upheld by its members. Another novo flock might be one where they've all decided not to be monogamous, but I really can't see that flock lasting long. I feel like it would turn into any Gossip Girl series where by the end, every single pairing has been tried and there's so much drama and baggage that the whole thing just collapses. I just feel like if monogamy is a thing at all in a society, then there's going to be an element of expectation and emotional betrayal when it's not upheld by a member. So maybe for the Qyaalyon, monogamy is not about the children, but about the emotional bond between the pair. If a partner cheated and say a child was born with a wing coloration making it extremely apparent what had happened, that's for the mated pair to work out between themselves. But maybe this is a culture that doesn't take it out on the children, since this is only an emotional issue, not an issue of birthright. Now, that might be a little too wish-fulfilling, but I don't know. What do you think? Another element of this to explore, their partnerships are based solely on a sacred vow. But those vows aren't one universal standard marriage vow. Maybe there are different types of partnerships with different expectations. Maybe there are more traditional, all-encompassing marriage vows, and maybe there are vows that are basically just a long-term hunting partnership. Maybe some vows have time limits, like until the children leave the nest, not until death do us part, or for the next 2 years and then we'll reevaluate. Maybe some vows are about the child-raising partnership alone and do not cover the partner's individual sex lives. I've already used a vow like this in one story, though it wasn't for the purpose of establishing an open marriage. It concerns a widow and widower who are good friends but not sexually interested in each other at all, partnering for the sake of raising their families as one. One last thing, I told you there was a lot to discuss here. The Qyaalyon don't necessarily care what is in a vow, they just care that whatever you do vow, you uphold. So what this really means in terms of marriage or partnership type vows is that I think there would be reasons for separation or an equivalent to divorce, but Qyaalyon would highly frown upon no-fault divorce. If your vow concerned being faithful to each other and one person cheated, then in that case they have already broken the vow and the other partner has no requirement to stay with them. If the vow concerns child raising and one partner becomes abusive to the children, they are at fault and they have broken the vow. But if the partners decide to separate in a no-fault divorce kind of equivalent, then in the eyes of the flock they both have violated the vow and both are at fault. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, but if it did, that would be one reason a hunter might leave their flock and start fresh, as there would be an attached stigma to being known as a vow breaker. I think the idea of pregnant and nursing women staying behind and helping to gather is a good one. They would likely be working with children and teenagers. I think having an adult with a fully formed brain around would be good. Okay, yes, this is true, but also I haven't had a reason to mention it yet, but hunters don't hunt every single day. Flying takes a lot of energy and sometimes they have to range over many miles in a day to bring home a decent amount of game, so they take rest days frequently and gather with the children on those days. So I don't think the children would ever be 100% unsupervised, though as you've mentioned, the teenagers in this culture would be considerably more responsible than we're used to seeing. How many flocks would return to one village? Are they large cities with hundreds or thousands in the winter, or is it like 2 or 3 flocks who gather and keep their elders in one place? The former, they're large. I haven't calculated yet to figure out exactly how large, but probably hundreds of flocks and thousands of people. That makes more sense anyways. It would be much easier to protect a town if you have a couple thousand people living in it during the summer, rather than like 4 old guys. Do the winter villages need to keep a younger flock member around for the year? They can't just leave the elderly members to fend for themselves. Okay, 2 things. I think most hunters retire sometime during their 50s. Some incredibly determined and incredibly lucky hunters might make it through their 60s, and some retire earlier, maybe in their 40s if they've been injured or just never really liked hunting that much. So not everyone in the winter towns is ancient and helpless. There are plenty of middle-aged Qyaalyon around to take care for the older ones, still strong and capable, just not great flyers anymore. And 2, yes, there would still be some people around who can guard them. We'll see in the next comment. How do they divide up skilled, non-hunting related tasks? Jobs like healers, midwives, priests, etc. We haven't gotten into it yet, but there are specialized guild flocks that operate out of the winter towns. Priests and healers have a base in town, but the members are available to be sent out to a specific flock in need. Another guild are the messengers. They primarily serve the elderly, coordinating communication between the flocks and acting as a sort of military or guard presence in town during the summer. But we will discuss guild flocks more in a future video. Do they learn how to do these crafts before they are elders? Because a lot of crafts take a long time to master. But the flocks do come home to the winter towns for 3 months of the year, when it's cold and there's little to do but sit indoors and work with your hands. So yes, they will definitely learn these skills throughout their lives, but it won't be their focus or their career until after they retire from hunting. I'm not sure that a culture that divides work between ages like this would automatically devalue gathering and preserving. Everyone knows that they will someday be old and doing those same things. This is a really good point. I didn't originally mean it to be a serious devaluing. It's not like a tiered class system. It's more like the hunters just have an ego about the work they do. Sort of like a mild form of 1950s misogyny that some individuals are quite obnoxious about while others have a more grounded outlook. But the second point you made is what I find interesting. I was comparing ageism to sexism pretty straight on, but there is a fundamental difference in that dividing by age, everyone knows that they will eventually be in the other category in a way that 1950s misogyny is not compatible with. So maybe it wouldn't be that extreme, or maybe it would be worse, with the young hunters in mortal terror of the day they're forced to retire. I feel like it would be both, some individuals dreading the day and some casually accepting it and some even looking forward to it. It seems like that all-female flock isn't very viable. Surely there aren't that many young Qyaalyon girls who hate men that much. Yeah, I agree. I think some flocks are long established, like hundreds of years old. Those tend to be safer and well run. The new flocks that are started, some last and become viable, but many don't. So the all-female flock might not last more than a generation. Or in order to keep the flock together, they might eventually be forced to relax their rules. Maybe if it does survive, it will eventually have men, but the yin and tay will always remain female through tradition. I don't know. In a case where a flock would fall apart, would other flocks be willing to take those people in, or would they remain flockless? Would this be equatable to homelessness? I think homelessness is a very good comparison. I think yes, they could definitely find a different flock to join, though depending on exactly how and why the flock fell apart, they might need to travel a distance to escape association. One problem I wonder about is how the De Nuovo flocks manage to get enough elder Qyaalyon. Also an interesting question. It might be like in the question above, maybe they recruit from other flocks and flocks that have fallen apart, or maybe it's just one of the risk factors in starting your own. Maybe you would have to trade some of your meat with other flocks to get the goods you need. Maybe starting a new flock is a lot like starting a new business, and you should expect a good decade of lean years. And that might be a reason new flocks often don't last long. Maybe it just takes too long to become established, and too many hunters tire of the struggle and leave before the first generation retires. Although that would be another good point as to why maybe the elders' work isn't that devalued after all, because the hunters bring home the bacon, leaning hard into that 1950s stereotype, but the elders are the one who make the home nice. They do the better cooking and make the clothing and mend the tents and make pottery and play music. So while the hunters may ensure a flock's survival, it's the elders who are responsible for a flock's comfort. Okay, now we come to my favorite series of comments. I love comments like this that are so obvious that like 5 people pointed it out, but it never even crossed my mind. If Qyaalyon segregate themselves based on ideals, wouldn't that start to create echo chambers and possibly create extremists? Yes. That would definitely be a danger with this sort of system, but like a really juicy, interesting danger. How would the Qyaalyon deal with these extreme flocks? My first answer was by shunning, but somebody else pointed out that there have been plenty of examples of religious, political, and cultural extremist groups thriving despite heavily being shunned. And that is also a good point. We haven't talked about the justice system yet, but Qyaalyon do not believe in prisons or locking people up. Shunning is their go-to with wrongdoers. So I feel like that would be their go-to with bad flocks, but like you said, it's not a perfect solution. However, let's compare it to their view on animals, in that domestication is breaking an animal's will and therefore bad, but hunting and killing an animal outright is totally okay. If we were to apply this logic to a justice system, I think that if a person was deemed too dangerous to safely shun, the Qyaalyon would be on board with capital punishment. The attitude might be something like, you are free to live a way we don't agree with if you go do it somewhere else. But in a more serious case, say in handling a murderer, if we as a group decide that the existence of your free will is a proven threat to others' free will, maybe you should just be taken off the board. So if we were to apply that logic to an entire rogue flock, say in the case I was talking about last time with the flechette hunters, if this one flock insisted on hunting in a way that wasted natural resources, and if they could not be shunned or otherwise persuaded into abandoning a practice that was deemed a threat to the ecosystem of the prairie as a whole, wow, that was a long sentence. I think that would be one reason the flocks might go to war. I can see 5 or 6 flocks getting fed up and banding together deciding to simply wipe the rogue flock out. It would be a messy way to deal with problems because then you have to adopt the rogue flock's children and hope that they don't grow up with a vendetta against you. But also there is no perfect method of justice, or our own world wouldn't be such a messy place. And one of the fun things about world building is getting to explore possible alternatives and what that might look like and the pitfalls that would come with it. Okay, a few more to wrap up with. With this one, I just want to clear up that the goddess of flight, Shakoba, has 4 wings and the Qyaalyon depict her as having all 6 Qyaalyon colorations. But those 6 colors are spread evenly across her wings in a speckled pattern, so as not to confuse her with the split-winged traitor figure. The way you describe old age grabbing them by the ankle and bringing them down to earth made me think that maybe that could be something a deity is based off of. Not a deity exactly, but it definitely could be a mythical figure or a spirit. The pantheon is extremely closed. There are exactly 11 gods and 11 goddesses, and there is no debate about it for plot reasons. However, there are lots of more local figures that stories are told about, and I can see old age personified as one that particularly troubles young Qyaalyon hunters. I think for the wing stealer, stealing the soul of the wings would be more horrific and scary as you're left physically intact, but your wings hang limp and useless. And related, certain toxins and injuries could lead to partial or full paralysis of limbs and body segments. Okay, I don't know if I like the idea of the wing stealer causing paralysis, but I do like the idea of a toxin that creates temporary paralysis being named after the wing stealer. And finally, I really want to be in your world. Well, good. That means we're getting somewhere.